studies for the university. It's probably the biggest week. Oh, really? Really? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that sounds pretty terrifying.
And also,
it's like sustainable development, basically. I don't know. It's kind of vague. I guess it seems to do a lot with tourism, like how to do tourism sustainably, like how to manage parks and stuff. But even though it's not like my main focus area, I thought it would be a good experience. Yeah, but I mean, it's easier because I'm going to be AI, so it looks really cool. What is that? You look at the picture. And you did like the hip hop days. You're pretty damn good. So I didn't know if you did something like this. Oh yeah.
Welcome to the Race, Justice, and Environment Seminar Series. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan London. Dr. London is a faculty speaker for the Center of Regional Change and an associate professor in the Department of Human and Community Development. His research focuses on rural community development and environmental justice. He uses participatory research methods, and much of his work has involved direct engagement and partnerships with community organizations. I'll talk about some of those relationships in today's seminar. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. London.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to engage with a group that's interested in race and social justice and environmental justice. Oh, there's monsters at the door. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of praxis and the connections between theory and action and the politics that are involved in making these kinds of connections in the context of environmental justice research. Before I get started, given that we have an intimate group, I'd just be interested to hear where people are coming from. Who's in the class that we'll be talking to? Okay, so most people. And then so I'll get to talk with you more. So the people who are not, could you just tell me who you are?
That's me. I'm Carol Johnson. I'm a geochemist, but here I'm in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Mechanical Engineering, but interested in environmental justice in the future.
I'm Will. I'm a PhD student here in the Earth and Environment Department. I do hydrology.
All right. Excellent. Glad that you're here. All right. Okay, so just to give a little bit of background on me, I sometimes think of myself as a rogue scholar, not quite the same thing as a road scholar, although I do take my act on the road. But just to get a little sense of sort of where I'm coming from, what sort of background I bring to my work. So I've always been in interdisciplinary programs, environmental studies, city regional planning, rural social science, and I've also connected professional work with academic work. So for a number of years I directed a nonprofit organization called Youth in Focus that trained high school age students in community action research. So when I was in that capacity, I called our group the Home for Wayward Academics, those who kind of had academic training but wanted to do more applied oriented work. And now back in the academy again, I run a research Center for Regional Change, that uses a participatory collaborative approach, working with disadvantaged communities, and kind of both through the direct work itself that I'll talk about, but also kind of trying to use that work as a platform to make interventions to transform higher education around these kinds of values of engaged scholarship, of putting social equity in the center of work. So I draw inspiration from a number of different sources, and just to kind of give credit and again kind of ground you in not just what I do, but why I do it and how I do it. I draw a lot of inspiration from Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Have people heard about him, read his work? No, put that on your reading list. One of his famous books is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he was an educator and worked in the slums, the favelas in Brazil, and worked with a model of liberatory or critical consciousness oriented research. So, or not research, but critical consciousness development education, by which he differentiated between that and banking education. So if you can imagine an education model where you envision the heads of your students as empty vessels, and the idea is for the professor to fill your head with knowledge. So the student is this very kind of passive recipient of knowledge. In his view, it was really based on supporting people to develop a critical awareness of the kinds of issues that were confronting them in their daily life, and then to be able to use that to actually change those conditions. So this idea of praxis. Another person who has influenced me is Bell Hooks, and he's written a lot. One kind of classic, if you want to put that on your reading list, is Teaching to Transgress. But she talks, brings that now. I mean, she's a professor at, I think she's now at CUNY, but she's in a number of different places over the years. Really thinking about her classroom as this place of addressing sort of structural factors in the sort of the oppressive dynamics of power and knowledge, but also thinking about how this can be a space of freedom, a practice of freedom. So this is the kind of academic that I aspire to be, and that these kind of values flow through my work. Just sort of really briefly, this is not the case with BU, but where I am at UC Davis, we're a land-grant university. Have people heard about that term you have? Did you go to a
Purdue and Virginia Tech.
Yeah, okay, so you're familiar. So this is this idea that the states would provide education that was useful for the people of that state. These were founded in the late or the mid-late 1800s, just after the Civil War, where the federal government granted to states literal land, thus the land grant, in return for really being a force for transformation. And so whenever I'm giving this kind of talk, particularly at another land-grant university, or other universities for that matter, it's useful to remind ourselves that that in the basic DNA of universities, they are set up to be social change entities, not just social reproductive entities. Okay, so with that kind of broad background, bringing it to more specifics of this community-based participatory action research model, or CBPAR, lots of acronyms out there. So this kind of research, again, in the way that I started to talk here, is based on a set of values. We'll get to the methodologies, but it really is based on this, these ideas of respect, of fairness, of justice, and addressing the kinds of like epistemic injustices, even epistemic violence, that makes certain kinds of knowledge seen as suspect and less than and not legitimate as a way to represent what's happening in the world. And then it's also a process, and I'll talk a bit more about the specific steps and activities. But it involves bringing the people who are most affected by a given issue, whether that's air pollution, water pollution, pesticides, etc., and bringing them into the knowledge production and dissemination and application process. So there's a number of different ways to visualize that. Just take a drink of water while you're absorbing. So this is a graphic created by some colleagues, Carolina Ballas and Rachel Morello-Frosch. And they talk about the CBP, they don't have the A in there, but it's community-based participatory research process as this sort of cycle. And this part will be, really familiar to people doing any kind of research, right? I mean, anyway, sort of from what are you trying to do, the design, the collection, analysis, and often and then evaluation, ideally. But they talk about the way in which this participatory model improves research in a number of different ways. It makes it more relevant, so that the goals of the research respond to issues of concern in communities. It's more rigorous, and this is kind of where sometimes there's a little bit more debate about why doing participatory work can actually make the science better. Why might you imagine that this engagement between researchers and community members might make the science actually better, more rigorous? That would be, say, compared to something that was less engaged.
I mean, some community members have very intimate knowledge of their communities, so they might think about new variables and new processes that an outsider wouldn't think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah.
Yeah, same. I guess there are tuition, like informally, there are advocacies for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right on. Yeah.
I remember reading in one of your papers you mentioned that like now that if you have like a whole community working on something, you have more resources, like more people, so you don't have to rely on like limited staff of like some other institution that would generally carry out the work. So yeah, you got like 24/7 reporting, monitoring, etc.
Yeah. So all of those I think are right on. That there's kind of a local knowledge that the researcher, as much as we invest ourselves in our field sites, that's a different kind of thing than if you have generations there. Or it's actually just reading a student of mine, her doctoral qualifying essays and talking about indigenous environmental justice. So as opposed to like a 5 or 10 year process of the researcher involved, and maybe a little bit longer. These are like 10 generations, 100 generations of knowledge, and that kind of learns some stuff over that amount of time. So that's held in many cases by people in the current generation. And then there is this kind of just presence in the moment of being able to be in a place 24/7 and capturing the subtleties of what's going on. Another way that this comes out, and I've experienced this myself, is when you're talking with people who aren't trained in the same way you are, you can't use jargon as easily or effectively. You can't do as much shorthand. You have to be clearer, and you can be more challenged on the assumptions that you might have, in your own discipline. And that goes actually for interdisciplinary work more broadly, of geochemists and social scientists and humanities folks. Then it also comes in with the community side. And then in the reach, it actually gets the information out into the hands of people who can use it. So another way, and this comes, again, this graphic from Rachel and Carolina, is this kind of continuum of levels of engagement. And so sort of on the far end of the least engagement, there's this idea of helicopter science, so sort of just the scientific enterprise that comes in, sets down, extracts its data, comes back up again, comes back to the academy, creates its knowledge products, and communities have, they have no influence on it. And in many cases it's extraction, they're not benefiting from it, in some cases it's actually harmful to them. So there's an ethical concerns here. And then as you move forward towards this more community-based, the community members play more substantive roles in the design of the work, how it's actually carried out, how it's actually implemented, and really who makes the decisions. It moves all the way towards this kind of ownership and really knowledge sovereignty from participant to partner. I've also developed this way of visualizing, and as you can tell, I'm kind of visual, so I'm giving you a bunch of different pictures to help see this. So there's one level on this, on the vertical, which is authority, like who makes the decisions, from how much role or how much power the community has in actually making decisions, and then on the horizontal is how many parts of the research do community members participate in. And so you get these sort of four quadrants, and the high has community defining, implementing, see the others. And so in some ways that's like really clear, right? I mean, there's this sort of quadrant 1 through 4, but more often than not, when you're doing this kind of work, it's kind of hazy. It's a little unclear. It's contested. Different people might have different, conceptions of how much power different entities are going to play, or what the expectations are, the different roles that the researcher and the community are going to play. And so one of the guidelines that I suggest to you, if people want to do this work, is a couple things, and I'll get to this through the examples, but one is just to be as clear as you can up front about what kind of model you are going to do, you're going to use, because it's not like there's just, in some cases this is a perfectly appropriate approach, and in other cases it's just not, that it doesn't make sense to, I think it's telling me it's time to wake up or something. That there's less value or just less appropriate process to involve community in a deeper way, and we'll talk about why some of those might be. And so there's trying to be clear, but also needing to negotiate these things as you go. So this is a graphic in a piece that just is coming out in the Journal of Action Research that I did with a couple different colleagues. And I developed this idea of, or imagining this participatory process as weaving. So you have in the, does anyone weave here? There's not as much weaving as there used to be back in the day. So there's sort of these two different parts of the weave. There's sort of the warp of the sort of horizontal fibers, and those are like really stuck to the loom. That's to kind of like set up the structure. And then the weft is this sort of thing that weaves throughout that, and it's much more flexible, more contingent, and it's sort of a way to think about the research process where the structure are really about what are the partners' expectations, who's providing the resources, who's making the kinds of decisions, and that, as much as possible, you want to have set up in advance. But then the partnership as it plays out is very much in process. It has to be adaptive, there's tension involved, and you kind of have to have humility in the sense that you may have this vision of the fabric that you want, and it looks often very different from what you end up with. Okay, so that's kind of the broad background. Let me, just because it is a nice small group, let me stop though and see any questions or observations that come up so far, things that are unclear. Good. Okay. So what I've put these principles into play with colleagues across the university and other universities too, and many of which are organized within the Center for Regional Change. And we worked on a wide variety of issues, and we put social equity, the concerns about who's getting access to all of these kinds of resources and who is getting the downsides of it, and who's making the decisions. So there are projects around environmental justice that I'll talk about, but we also have work on youth development, civic engagement, and sort of using mapping for understanding regional patterns of disparity on a variety of issues. And I can talk about any of those if you like. So one project that I'll focus on, and for those majority of you here in the class, you've read a couple of these papers. So this is focused on the Central Valley in California, or the southern part of it called the San Joaquin Valley. Is anyone from California? Been to California? Been to California? Have you driven through Central Valley, like the Bay Area through California? It's kind of, it's in some ways like it's the powerhouse of the state. It has, they call it like the fruit and nut bowl of the country, like the vast percentages of all like the almonds and different kind of fruit and so on, lettuce and so on, come from the Central Valley, and it kind of has this sense of abundance, but it also has this sort of shadow side. So when we were running this project, we drive up and down from Davis to the Central Valley really frequently, and one time I picked up this woman named Rosenda Mataka at her home, right. Basically, this was like essentially across the street from her house. And these were apricots that are growing. These are bees. And there's like a lot of interesting stories about like hive collapse and kind of detective work about what's going on around pesticides and so on. But anyway, it looked really beautiful to me. And I said, wow, Rosenda, this is like, you're so lucky to live in this beautiful place. Look at all these flowering trees. And she said, Jonathan, I really hate when the flowers come out. I was like, well, you hate when the flowers come out? How come? She's like, because that means they're going to come spray herbicides to keep down, if it's nice and rainy, then keep down all the weeds. Whenever they spray, we always get asthma. The people who are young or old are often getting really sick because of all the impact on their lungs. We often actually have to stay inside on spray days. So it really kind of set up to me like this local knowledge piece of, from one perspective, this sort of aesthetic experience, and another, this like very lived life experience. The Central Valley also has really high asthma rates, 1 in 5 children, as you can see on the T-shirt there. This T-shirt was worn by this woman, Teresa de Anda, who was an environmental justice activist until last year, or 2 years ago, I guess now, that she died of cancer, and a lot of other people had health issues in her family, and it wasn't unlikely that there wasn't some kind of environmental impact on her body. It was a huge loss for the region. Standing next to him is a guy named Gustavo Aguirre, who came from the farm worker movement and is lifting up the voices of the community. The Central Valley also has really poor drinking water. These are samples from the different communities from Arosi and Ucor and Cutler. And the activists who were working for years and years and decades really to get clean drinking water in their community about 7 or 8 years ago really came together in this massive campaign. And one of the things they did is sample from the taps in all these different communities the different drinking water. And then they brought that to the state capitol and sort of poured all those different bottles into this one big one and called that the Central Valley Blend. And when they brought it to all the hearing rooms when the legislators were considering, either passing these more stringent guidelines for drinking water and investing in drinking water infrastructure. And for those who were planning to vote against the bill, they offered them up a nice drink of the Central Valley Blend. And not surprisingly, most people passed on it. They passed on drinking it, but they actually eventually signed something called the Human Right to Water, which is a really groundbreaking bill, talking about environment not just from a sort of a quality of life, but from a human rights perspective, and kind of putting it into this global human rights UN kind of language. So that was a really positive effort. It's also a place, because of all the agriculture with massive pesticides, the three of the heaviest agricultural producing counties in the state in the country are in California, in the San Joaquin Valley, and they're also, not coincidentally, the counties that have the highest application rates of agricultural pesticides. I should say that this picture and this and then the next one were all taken by a former student of mine who's going to lecture next week, Tracy Perkins, and she did this really amazing, maybe you read her stuff already, but this really amazing work collecting stories of women environmental justice activists and then doing a whole set of photographic portraitures. So this is this woman looking at her grandchild. She had been dressed up for working out in the sun. You can see probably not very good at keeping pesticides off her body, and then coming into the house, there's often cases of cross-contamination of people out in the fields and bringing polluted clothes in as much as they try to protect themselves and their family. But the Valley is also a place of tremendous activism, and on all of these issues, on pesticides, on air quality, on water quality, there's a really inspiring set of social movements. This woman here, Catherine Rupa White, was one of my doctoral students, and she directed this thing called the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. And this was a protest in the place called Kettleman City. It's the largest hazardous waste dump west of Mississippi. So this is sort of the place, this is sort of the context in which I've been doing my work. So both a real, kind of a heavy sense of injustice, but also really terrific inspiration for the activists that are facing these kinds of issues. So this is sort of like this lived life experience, and a lot of the language that has come together to bring that community knowledge into more of a scientific discourse centers around this idea of cumulative impact. So just, are people familiar with that terminology? Yeah, okay. Just from reading my papers, or is that something that you're dealing with in your classes more broadly? So maybe somewhat new? Okay.
You mentioned something.
Sorry?
You mentioned something.
Great, okay. Yeah, it's very much in that environmental justice discourse. So just to kind of map it out a little bit. So here's our generic body. There are all kinds of environmental threats. Oh, sorry, that comes next. We start with the positive. We all have assets and strengths, whether that's like in our own bodies, our families, our communities, our social movements. This is from the farmer herders, yes, it can be done. But then we're also affected by all kinds of environmental hazards: what we drink, what we breathe, what we eat, the places that we live, work, and play. So that's affecting all of us in the room, all of us everywhere. We have these sort of buffering strengths, and we have these hazards. But the idea with cumulative impacts also is that not all of us experience the environment in the same way. That there are these sort of social and structural vulnerabilities. Just an image from Jim Crow, like blacks over here, whites over here, where they could sit, where they could go to the bathroom, where they could eat and drink, where they could work, where they could live. So you could imagine, let's say, you're living in a small rural community, maybe you're an undocumented immigrant, maybe you're working outside in agriculture or construction, the same, and maybe your house doesn't have air conditioning, and you don't live in a place with good transit, and you don't have a car. Your experience of the same level of air pollution in your county or in your region is going to be really different, right, from if you live in a house and you have good air conditioning and you buy organic food and you drive to work and you work in a nice air-conditioned office and you have great health insurance and you're not working 2 or 3 jobs, you're not facing deportation risks. The level of environmental exposures and the level of social stresses are really different across those 2 entities. So this is sort of that formula of social factors, environmental factors, and these sort of buffering factors. And again, there's a lot of literature in the public health science, and environmental science, and social science. So given that understanding, either from the scientific perspective and then from the community perspective, a number of activists came together to create this thing called the San Joaquin Valley Cumulative Health Impacts Project, SJV-CHIP. And again, wanting to have a way to not just talk about, but to document and put into the research literature the kinds of experiences that people are facing and inform policymakers about that. And then to be able to do that, they needed to work with academics who both understood these issues and had a level of legitimacy and clout. So a number of those organizations turned to our group at UC Davis, partly because we did good science, but also because we were kind of aware of these colonial relationships that were kind of that helicopter science of extracting from a community or doing things that were going to be even in that could harm a community. So invited us to develop a project over a number of years to be able to map these kinds of cumulative impacts and do it in a policy relevant way. But to do this in a way that would address that kind of history of colonial dynamics, we came up with, on their insistence, but with our agreement and support, a set of these agreements. So about the leadership and authority, remember that kind of vertical access there about how much power communities would have, that essentially summed up in the first one, that communities would speak for themselves, would have agency and sovereignty over the knowledge and how it was used, and a real issue about funding, because there's not a lot of it, there's a lot of competition for it. They didn't want us competing with it, and they wanted this to actually become an asset for them. So we had a wide variety of funding agreements. And then we sort of moved through this learning process together. So it's sort of a similar figure to the one I showed before at one of our early workshops. This is in Spanish, Fuentes de Contaminación, sources of contamination. And it talked about air pollution, water pollution, pesticides, oil industry infrastructure, and others. And to start with something really simple, getting it just down on paper, and then creating this sort of series of maps. And this is actually saying this to Steve, but he stepped out here. But this was my colleague Donlin Huang, who was a postdoc from China working with me, and she was a real GIS expert. So she developed a range of maps, and we spent about a year just talking with each other about what kind of maps were actually going to best represent these kinds of issues. Like what is a map? How do you create a map? What are the different ways that you can represent these kinds of data in a way that are going to be useful? And I'll talk about the content of the map. But then at the end, what was sort of most satisfying to me, I had the report here. But what was most satisfying is that the community members they were working with had the report in their hands, and that they owned it. They believed that this, although they actually didn't want their names on the front cover, even though if from an ethical point of view, we were saying, look, this is a lot of your knowledge. You helped us develop this. You should be considered authors. And they said, well, actually, we don't want that, because it's going to be more useful for us if this is authored by UC Davis, and we can hold this up and say, look, this is a UC Davis study. They wanted their names on the back and acknowledgments, which we did, of course. But then they've been able to use it over the years, and I'll talk a little bit about how. So that's sort of some of the process. The content was that they wanted to create an alternative to this map. This is the San Joaquin Valley, this like 250-mile length and about 75 miles wide, so a pretty big region. And this map was created by the Air District in the region, and this was the way they were representing environmental justice and using just a couple criteria: air quality and percent of low-income people and Latinos, and it pretty much covered the whole valley, which in some cases was really useful to say, look, there's a big environmental justice problem here, but why might that not be so useful if you're an environmental justice advocate and you're trying to get support in your community? Why might this map not be so useful, do you think? Yes?
Well, it sort of minimizes like the local experiences of each little town that might have different reasons for.
Yeah, it sort of is this, really generalized picture. If you're in one particular place, it doesn't help you in trying to priority for issues there. Absolutely. It also allowed the Air District to basically spend its environmental justice budget sort of anywhere and in any way it wanted, and they could still say, look, it's an environmental justice expenditure. And so we worked with the organizations that I showed you to, add a wide variety of other kinds of criteria. So you can see different kinds of pollution, environmental hazards, and different kind of social vulnerability. And when we mapped those this was just with the cumulative environmental hazards on the vertical and social vulnerability here, sort of 3 by 3. These three quantiles were the ones that had the highest degrees of both environmental and social vulnerabilities, and that mapped onto the region showed these really significant patterns of disparity. In the urban areas, it was often the south and west quadrants. This is actually east of Bakersdale, but mostly the south and west quadrants of the cities that had these real patterns of disparity, where people of color, low-income people, immigrants, were living in and around the most concentrated levels of a wide variety of environmental hazards. And then you also had this sort of like archipelago of smaller rural communities that also had these really significant environmental justice concerns. So they were able to use this map again to do a number of things that I'll show you, but was able to, instead of this kind of green check, blank check, to really say, look, these are the places that need extra protection, these are the places that need extra participation and engagement. So that drew from the community knowledge to say, here are the kinds of issues, and these are the kinds of maps that would help best illustrate that. But it was also really important to go from that 30,000 foot level to the ground level. So we worked with our community partners to do these very grassroots mapping workshops. Keep your eye on this woman. Her name is Mary Curry, who worked in one of those high environmental justice areas in Fresno. And we developed this format where they worked on these huge sort of tabletop aerial photos, and then they were able to, at a scale that they were able to like see their house and their church and their school and the industrial facilities nearby, say. So they marked on here, what were the places that were really of concern to them that may not be on a government database, say, but they knew was an issue. For example, a place that the EPA or the city believed or said was a cleaned up area, but the people in the community knew it wasn't really cleaned up. Or a place that was supposed to be fenced off, but if you don't live in the neighborhood, you don't know that when it rains, the streets flood, and so the kids, when they're walking to school, cut through that field, and they're getting, exposure to these kinds of contaminants. None of that stuff shows up on a database easily. So then we took that and created kind of just a really simple GIS thing about these different places of pollution sites that were on the government databases, those that the residents identified, and then took those data and put it into a GIS system and mapped it, in this case, over the percent people of color, where the darker blues are where more people of color are, greens are less, and yellow even less. And then also where the clusters of environmental concerns were in, as you can kind of imagine, doesn't take too much of a leap of analysis, that the places where there are more people of color were the places where there were higher concentrations of these kinds of environmental hazards. And so with these maps, the community groups, so there's Mary Curry and then there's Mary Curry, would use these maps in their own advocacy. And while we were, they were front stage here, we were backstage creating these, and then they were front stage again, representing the kinds of issues that they've been talking about for, years, but now we're able to do it with a whole other kind of data set behind them. So as a result of the project, they talked about what were the sorts of impacts. So they were able to get kind of this greater technical understanding, and then just kind of like the data, in many cases it's their data, but then be able to dig down. This is like the kind of Freirean critical consciousness, to look at these systemic issues of racism, and then kind of a way to help promote the vision of community that they're really striving for. So just kind of in a summary way, let's go through these. So there were a number of challenges and responses. So one of the issues is that we had received some funding before we went out to the community, because we wanted to be able to say we can actually do something before we promise it. But they were somewhat concerned that, hey, why do you have this money and you haven't asked us about it? So that was when we created this whole set of agreements. There was some kind of concern about them, being able to create this coalition over the course of years without sort of, and that being outside of their typical work. So we helped them in facilitation, and then we were really stepping into like a political minefield in a lot of ways. These environmental justice issues are really hotly contested in all sorts of places, in Boston and in the Central Valley. And so we had an issue where one of the agricultural lobbyists who works for big agriculture in the state was upset with our report. They felt like we were, in our description of pesticide applications, were sort of giving a bad rap to industry and saying that they were poisoning people. And in fact, that's not what we were saying. We were just using the data to actually, from government databases, to map where these things were and who lives around them. So the lobbyist called the president of the University of California to complain. And this has like a long precedent all the way back to the 40s, where there was a rural sociologist Walter Goldschmidt, who wrote this really path-breaking book called As You Sow. If you're interested in like rural sociology or rural social science, that's another thing to put on your list, As You Sow, where he looked at the impacts of big agriculture on community vitality. And the ag industry was so upset, they called the president, and at that time, in the 40s, it was a little different period, the university disbanded his whole research program and made the university pledge that it would never have a rural sociology program again. And now, 70 years later, there's no rural sociology program anywhere in the University of California system. So that getting calls from the ag industry to the president is sort of like a big deal. And I was a junior or pre-tenure professor, and it sort of passed down from the president, vice president, and then my dean. And my dean called me into the office and said, "Look, I've got this call, and I need to see what your methodology is because we're getting this kind of critique." So I shared it with him and called me back and said, "Look, it's not really great for us to get critiques from the industry, but I've looked at your methodology. It's totally sound, and I'm going to back you up on this." And I was like, "Whew!" Big sigh of relief. And we had done a good job. We did this very intense community engagement, but as I was saying in that rigor, relevance, reach, it was really rigorous work. So we were able to move through it. So the kinds of impacts that it had, we had a big impact on federal policy where the US EPA created a whole priority area in the San Joaquin Valley. The state used a lot of our methodology to create their own tool called the California Environmental Screening, or California Environmental Screening Method, CalEnviro Screen. And also at the regional level, the activists use this for a lot of sustainable community development work. Okay, so I'm going to talk about another center briefly, but any sort of questions or responses on this? Yeah.
Do these kind of problems with funding happen a lot, like in the past? Like conflicts that don't really matter for the science itself.
It does in a number of ways. I mean, and you think right now in this current federal administration, it's going to matter hugely. But yeah, overall, I mean, a lot of the nonprofits that we work with have very slim funding. So anything that threatens that is significant. And even for a lot of this environmental justice, like community engaged research, there's just not a lot of funding for it. The center that I'll show you next is somewhat of an exception, but it's a very political issue for sure.
So
Yeah.
that's because people who hold the funds are scared of consequences from people who wouldn't be happy with the results.
Yeah, in some cases. So just as one example, a lot of these groups get funding from the US EPA, and to get those funds, they have to sign away their right to litigate or sue the government, which kind of makes sense if the government gives you money, you can't sue them. But on the other hand, it takes away one of their key power tools. And there's not a lot of other funds. These are kind of pretty high value funds. So yeah, that's definitely a concern. Okay, so let me bring to kind of the bigger science and a different way of doing community engagement. So we've been working with a National Institute of Environmental Health Science center at UC Davis on environmental health science. My colleague Karen Andrade, who's a postdoc, is managing that. We've got these community partners, Naomi Martinez, Sarah Sharp, and other staff, Sergio Cuellar, and Krista Happinen, who are working together to really connect the environmental health science that's happening on campus with community organizations. So in this case, I'm not conducting the research, we're sort of playing this matchmaker role. And I'll talk about these sort of 3 different ways for time's sake. I'll go somewhat quickly. But we have an advisory committee, we've got training for academics to be able to connect with communities, we've got training for communities to understand the environmental science, and then we're using that to create these collaborative research projects. So our stakeholder advisory committee brings environmental justice and health activists together with our scientists in dialogue to really hear what are the issues that are most concerned to communities, what are ways that research could be structured to be of help. We've also created these training programs where I mentioned where people use these sort of training around community organizing methods to help think about how science can help intervene and change these kinds of dynamics in the communities by helping to inform what are the kinds of environmental justice issues out there. We're exploring ways to deal with that. Scientists and community members speak different languages, even if it's in English. They're sort of different science and policy languages, and what are the capacities that are needed. We've just had our first Environmental Health Science Academy, where we brought community members to learn about hydrology. This is this really cool little sand tray model to show how groundwater moves and how sort of plumes of contamination can move into groundwater up into wells and so on. There's a fish toxicology lab. This is this whole wall of questions, like what are the kinds of issues and what are the kinds of questions people have that can be answered through environmental health science. This is one of the activists, Tom Bailey. This is the director of our center, epidemiologist, Roberto Spicciotto. So this is sort of this way of kind of bridging these cultures of community and science. And then we've developed a number of ways to bring those sorts of partnerships and create projects. So we've had meetings where, so this is Sarah Aird, who runs the Californians for Pesticide Reform, talking with a bunch of scientists, and then they filled out this little matrix about what were the issues, what was the science that would be needed to help address those issues, and then they kind of filled this out, and they had this idea of creating an economic analysis for human, environmental, and climate costs of continued exposure to pesticides, particularly fumigants and organic phosphates. And by the way, the US EPA, after I think like 10 years of analysis of this one really potent pesticide, chlorpyrifos, they were just about to ban it at the end of the Obama administration, and the current administration's EPA has pulled that back and said, well, we're gonna, the science isn't good enough. We're gonna hold off this regulation. So it's quite a blow to the communities. But through this kind of process, they've been able to highlight a number of different kinds of projects. So now through our research center, there's different projects on water and air. I was talking about at lunch about these biodigesters of taking cow manure and extracting the methane, which is good for climate, but it can have some serious localized air quality issues with pesticides. We've also done a number of projects, or a number of ways to then document the work that we're doing. So here's Karin giving a poster at an environmental health science national symposium, and that's a really critical thing, not just to do the work, but also to share it. So I'll close just with some lessons learned after doing this work for 20 years, I guess, at this point. So first is to really figure out, like, what is the model of this community engagement that works for that given setting? And those questions are, based on, like, what are the capacities of the scientists, the capacities of the community members, how quick do you need results, how certain or uncertain is the science, what are the kinds of resources that you have available, And that will help you figure out on that continuum how participatory. And it's okay that if it's not the ultimate level of participation, because that doesn't fit in all settings. Once you figure that out, and along the way to adopt what one of my colleagues, Jan Marie Garcia, has called a cultural humility model as opposed to cultural competence, with the idea that we're all learning all the time about how to work in diverse communities. We don't just figure it out and then run with it. There's this idea of checking your privilege. Don't get involved in power play as an academic, but also learn how to use it. It can be really powerful as an ally, as trained academics, as you all are being trained, and others that are trained. That it can actually you can be a really powerful ally to really work with the tensions. Like we created that set of agreements with our San Joaquin Valley CHIP project. One really crucial thing is it's great to be able to bring in all this community engagement, but it's also really important to compensate the groups, make sure that they're being honored for wisdom because it's really valuable, but also value it by paying for it, because it doesn't come cheaply, although that's often the expectation that communities are just going to sort of volunteer this stuff. I mean, we're getting paid, I'm getting paid to be there, so they should be as well. These are long-term issues in the making, and they're going to need long-term solutions. So with that, I'll close and invite your questions or thoughts. Yeah.
So you were mentioning before about the quality of the science that the community gathers. How do you ensure that it's accurate information and that it holds water, like that you can actually make a convincing argument based on it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. So that's actually where that rigor comes in. So it's not just sort of the community checking the scientists, but the other way around. I mean, one example is there's a lot of concern about nitrates in drinking water, which is a real concern. But the science is a little less certain on the relative risk of nitrates, say, compared to like arsenic or other kinds of things. And so we're kind of now in this dialogue with the community groups to share that science and help inform their advocacy. And it may be that nitrates aren't, even though that's a huge concern and needs to be addressed, it may not be the most strategic and the sort of the greatest benefit for health. So that's sort of one point. Another way of looking at it is community groups are often using these, and I think some of this is, you've seen this in some of your other course readings, these sort of mobile air quality monitors, these sort of the bucket brigades or these sort of drift catchers, where it's fairly inexpensive, fairly mobile, so they're actually using them and collecting air samples. But in a lot of cases, they're putting those kinds of low-cost sensors near, like the government-run, $10,000 or so the really big ones, like hundreds of thousands of dollar monitors, and check, kind of calibrating or across all of them, cross-check across all of them, and finding out like these are actually pretty good. These low-cost sensors are actually tracking pretty well, what these sort of higher end ones are. But it is really important to have those kinds of tests, both so you trust in the validity of the data, but also that you're addressing the right set of questions. So I think it's not we don't want to just take the scientists as the only word. We need to have community voices, but similarly, just having those community voices without that partnership misses something important. And that's why I do think it's this kind of weaving together approach. That's a good question.
So in the context of the land grant institution you work at, what is the role of the extension office in all of this? Are they sympathetic or not to this kind of research?
Yeah. So in the past, there's definitely been the extension has had much more of connection to the larger, industrial, agricultural, as the key clients or partners. And that certainly still continues to some degree, but there's a newer generation coming into extension that really has much more. Some of them have an explicit social justice orientation, but a lot of them have a real community engaged orientation. And even those that are working with agriculture, they're thinking about farm workers, well-being, like food security amongst farm workers, environmental or occupational health issues. So I think there's a shift happening. It's not as fast as some of us would like, but it's definitely not an extension of a generation yet. And I should say it's a key resource. I mean, we have advisors who are if not based and working in all parts of the state, all 58 counties. So it's a huge asset for people who want to do community-based work to have community-based element of the university side. I think it's something that we're working with, but I think there's even more that we can do. Others can do too. Yes.
So a practical question. So you mentioned that you're working with communities on the mapping project. That you talked for a year about maps. Like how often were you meeting? Was that a year to make your report, or was that just to give the basis so that everyone was on the same page and brainstorming and things like that?
Yeah, so it was kind of a year, and not just talking about the maps, but really drawing the kind of whole process from developing the partnership, those agreements took a while to kind of work through, clarifying what they really wanted, what we could and couldn't do. We had a joke where we would come into one of the meetings and say, okay, here are these sort of 3 different options. We could map this way, or this way, and they would usually say yes, meaning yes, do all 3 of them. We're no, we're talking about or, but we tried to figure out a way to be adaptable. So anyway, sort of the developing working agreements, figuring out what to map, how to map it, and then onward. And we would have, it was sort of monthly meetings down in, it was a 3-hour drive for us from Davis down to Fresno. So it was an investment for sure. And then there was about a year of actually producing and doing the analysis, and another 6 months or so of developing the report and the policy recommendations. Another 6 months of really intensive application and dissemination. But this came out in 2011, and there's literally I go to meetings and people are still waving the report and saying, look, this UC Davis report said there are these kinds of environmental justices in place. So it's the idea of you start slow to go fast, or certainly to go long. So it was time well spent, but it was a lot of time. And as a pre-tenured professor at the time, there was a cost to it. It worked out okay. I got tenure, but it was there were definitely trade-offs from times that I could have been in my office writing that next journal article that I was driving down to Fresno.
Mm-hmm. So who was doing the facilitating of these meetings? Was that your team, or is it someone in the community?
Yeah, so we had a blue pastor in the slides without mentioning your name, but we had all the people holding the report. So there was a grad student who was working with me at the time. She's a PhD student in geography, Tara Zagofsky, and she had been and now continues to be a professional facilitator and doing public participation. So she really designed